Okay, that actually triggered an interesting thought because we actually talked about this on Plat Chat today. Like
Sure.
at London Spitfire, how much do you guys do in terms of preparation for individual teams? Of like, because I was when I was a player in a team, I had different levels of preparation for different teams that I played for. Like some teams were like, it's more about focusing on us and playing our fundamentals right, compared to we need to look at how they play and how to isolate and use our strategy to undermine theirs. Like how much did London Spitfire do both of those?
I think we were definitely on the far end of the spectrum when it comes to preparation. I think especially when you have a scout who's as like talented and as skilled as Commander X is, like you're a fool not to use your scouting information. He's really good at it with stats and everything. But I think even us, who I think probably scout more than probably any team in the league, scouts less than people think. I mean, we're talking maybe an hour of VOD review, maybe 45 minutes of discussion tops over the course of an entire week for an opponent. Because like what you said, it really is, it's more about the big stuff. All right, we probably think they might do this rotate, or they definitely seem to be a little bit impatient with this ultimate, but you can't, it's just impossible in Overwatch to go into the nitty gritty. It's not like, you know, footballer, like where you can tell like their tendencies when it comes to, you know, corner kicking, or it's not like any other sport where you can know what play they're running. It's more about very big tendencies and then focusing on your own gameplay like after that, I guess.
So to sort of explain that to like the average viewer, so so less so about like, hey, when they come to this corner, they tend to, you know, these players tend to go over here, blah blah blah. Is it more about like, although when he plays Genji, he has multiple examples of him exposing himself by going too aggressive in this kind of situation? Is that it?
Yes, exactly. Or especially if we know the map specific they're going to play. Like that, like I said, there might be specific scouting if we've seen them play an official that they really like this rotate on this map. And that's about as specific as it gets. Outside of that, it's very general, basic stuff, because I think in the middle of a match, video games are like, just esports in general is just unbelievably mentally engaging, and you can't be engaged in your own play. And like the three little details or tendencies, it's just not possible. Like we're not AI, sadly. So, you know.
Yeah, because I remember when I was on the Valiant, actually, when I was like first joining that team, we actually had Damon come in. He used to be a coach for that team, and he did the same thing of like, the problem that we had was when he first started doing them, he was just overwhelming us with information. He's just like, we are in like an hour debrief of him talking about all the little things about all the teams do. And then we would come out of that and like, I would look across at like halfway through and Kariv's just like lying down, like eyes closed and stuff like that. Like people just don't have the ability to absorb that level of information, right? Like, and then apply it in the game. So it's interesting to sort of see if that, like, that's sort of the interesting consensus that you guys
just a big gap between knowledge and skill, right? If you can have, even if you were able to maintain focus during an entire review like that, you're just not going to be able to actually apply it, so then the result is almost meaningless. And I think that's like the really careful line that we had to tread throughout the season, because Chris, X, and myself were super intense, passionate coaches, but players have to be able to understand and process it and really come up with stuff on their own too. Otherwise, it's just like, you've done a lot of work, but it's really meant nothing, right?
Let's say like Paris Eternal this year, for example. It's like they're a team that they had a lot of confidence from last season, but there was almost that level of expectation on them now, right? It's like they did well last season. Now you guys have to back that up. And all of a sudden they put that pressure on themselves to be like, oh shit, we're not performing that well. You start losing some scrims, you start losing that confidence. And you see, I'm sure you can speak more to this. Of like, I remember when I was a player of like, as you can see players losing confidence in their own gameplay as they start losing scrims, as they start losing matches. Like, you know, fans like to act like, oh my God, they're depressed because they lost this match. It's like, no, this person's been depressed for 3 weeks because they've been getting shit on in scrims because they have no confidence in themselves.
100%.
Like,
100%.
And like, is that something that you're just trying to like bundle up and make sure that your players are aware of? Like, that's what you said, the Christopher mentality?
Really, yeah. I mean, I think even like London Spitfire last season, I wasn't there for this, I mean, for the first 7 months of their training, but I think that was what Paris was this season, right? There's expectations of British Hurricane, oh, they're going to the league. And from what I know, they were doing relatively well in scrims early on. But then, you know, it doesn't quite translate into matches, and then it starts to snowball. And then I think with us, it was the opposite. Like I used to joke that we had the easiest job of anybody early in the season because everybody puts us in last place, and that's every coach's dream. Because it's like there's no expectations, right? If we lose, okay, everybody's like, all right, sick, you know? It's the real tricky part, like you said, though, is the Paris, right? And for us, it's like, or for London, it was really kind of Hawaii and I guess this stage as well, where now people know that we're not bad, right? So now the expectations are a little higher, and then there's a little bit more pressure, and so you really need players that are. One thing I've always said is like better people make better players. And that's where like you have players like the Hotties and the Sparkers and the coaches like Chris that are like just have developed this iron mental and developed this maturity, and so that carries over into officials, right? Like that carries in. And that's the thing is like as a coach, can you develop your players to be better, more mature, like more patient humans? Because like that's where the confidence goes. If you're not a confident person, if you're lazy or you don't have a lot of things that you do besides Overwatch, you haven't really developed as a person, you haven't really developed your character, then the second that adversity hits, you crumble.
Where does that culture come from for London? Because obviously, you guys don't have the budget for like a sports psychologist and a personal trainer and those kind of things that some of these other teams have. But, I see you guys posting, like, your players posting photos of going to the gym. They always seem to be having a great time. Like, is there a player or is there a coach that's, like, leading that charge, like, promoting that culture? I
mean, obviously, it always starts with your head coach, right? Like, he's the one that always prioritizes where things is. And Chris is a relatively physically active guy. He's very, very confident and kind of exudes, like, I got this under control and we're going to be working hard. And so everybody kind of follows suit. But it really is a collaborative effort. I mean, everybody... I'm a big workout guy. I'm big into mental performance. When I was working with him, that was something that I was always working on with the players one-on-one is confidence, mental performance, individual goals. Even things like, this sounds really corny, and I won't talk about the player, but one of the players that I was working with, for a period of time, we did nothing but talk about, like, your job is to take walks and to get sleep, and it was like a daily check-in, like, how did you sleep? Were you taking a walk? Were you doing this? And little things like that. It's just like every single player has to be involved in it. Every single player has to kind of buy in, and it doesn't happen immediately, right? Like, I think Sparker had an interview with Yiska today, and he was talking a little bit about how, like, when I first started, it was just me and Hottie at the gym, and then now there's this player and then this player and everybody. And I think that's kind of like what you see, right? Is there's one or two confident players, Chris setting the environment. It doesn't really catch. We win a game. Okay, maybe now there's a little bit more confidence. Maybe there's a little bit less degenerative behavior, a little bit more communication between guys dealing with their problems. One thing that Chris was always like adamant about, even early on in the season, was like bedtimes, right? We are a very non-degenerate bedtime team. I know we start our day, and we are in VOD review at 9 a.m. PST, and those guys are in bed, most of them probably asleep, like before 11:30, which is like crazy for gamers, right? Like you and I both.
That's a hard thing to sell.
That is insane. And that was one thing that Chris was like, we're not bending on that. I'm not having to sell you on this. You're just going to have to do it. But the rest of the culture, that kind of came in time.
Yeah, no, and I think that's something that a lot of people don't realize. Like that, like, talking from my experience of someone who has like seen that opposite culture, is like Dallas Fuel 2018 is like the opposite of end of the spectrum of what you guys went through. Of, we didn't get predicted last, we got predicted first. And then when I signed to that team, I was like, I'm just going to sit on the bench and I'm just going to vibe out over here because you guys are going to do great. And then internally, there was so many issues of, like, as you said, players not sleeping enough. We had certain players showing up and they're like, I slept like 2 hours last night. And then they're just like, they're shitty. They don't want to scrim. They don't want to do anything. They don't want to VOD review. Then you have players eating poorly. Like, we had a bunch of players who just ate really poorly and they wouldn't want to eat any of the food that was supplied. And then like, it really compounds into that kind of like culture, and then it like falls apart for you so quickly because those negative things just go. And like, these things can be covered up by winning, right? Like, if you're winning, it doesn't matter that some of your players' sleep schedules suck, that you're eating badly, that you're not going to the gym, because you guys are talented enough to win. But the teams that are the best have the best players and they have the correct culture, because that they really feed on top of each other. And then whenever you think of these teams that have like really good players that seem to fail, it usually comes from a management side of they're not treating the players, and they're giving the players what I like to call too much freedom of their choices. Of like, you need a parental figure, you need a hard-hitting head coach who doesn't run it like a boot camp, but respects the players and promotes healthy habits.
100%. Like, you need a lot of and that's where, like, I think player leadership is so crucial as well, because I think what you said is like the coach has to set the standard, has to be that parental figure, but it makes your job a million times easier when you've got, even if it's just one respected player kind of setting the standard. And I think that's where like everybody talks about like, you know, Chadi, you know, oh yeah, Chadi. Hadi has been that player really this season consistently. You know, when things are going really poorly, when scrims are people are getting frustrated, when people are degenning it up, you know, Hadi is always setting the good example, encouraging the guys, and like he has a tendency to be, he's a very critical guy and a very hard worker. So there's a tendency for players like that to be negative and critical and frustrated. That was something that Hadi struggled with last season, right? I'm putting in so much effort, I'm doing this and this and that, right? This season, he has improved himself to where he is the guy that's like encouraging, right? He's like, all right guys, come on, we can do this. Like always in scrims, always in officials, he's always been that guy. And like that makes that kind of work as a coaching staff for Chris so much easier. You get one player setting the tempo. Now you got two players, and now you've got 5 players working out and going to bed at a reasonable time. Are you gonna be that 6th guy? There's no way, right?
And that's it. Like, especially like as you said, when you have so many rookies, like you guys have so many like new players. You brought Landon on in the middle of the stage. Like that really is important. Like Landon, I'm sure has just walked in as like, well, everyone's going to the gym. Well, I guess I go to the gym as well. Like it's such a team thing, or like it's such an important thing to have that positive culture, and like
100%.
You can see it in the results. Okay, absolutely. So a lot of people don't really understand what coaches do, like in the league, because it's like it is a very unique thing. You have 3 coaches. You have a head coach. You have an analytical coach. You have all that kind of stuff. Like, what in your opinion is like an assistant coach? Because we've talked about head coaches, they are very culture driven.
Yes.
They need to understand the game at a high level, but they don't need to be that super analytical guy.
Yes.
You're that guy for the team. What do you do for a team like the London Spitfire?
So I can say like a lot of it depends on coach to coach. I think Chris is definitely one of the more strategic leaned coaches that I've worked with. Like he's as good, if not better, than a lot of strategic coaches in the league. He really knows the game well. But from an assistant coach side of things, it's definitely like, it really, I think, is something that you can't like really buttonhole yourself into. You really have to kind of just read the coach, read the individual. I think Commander X is a great example of that, where he is and he's really an analyst. Like that's primarily his goal. And we're talking about a league that doesn't really employ analysts, right? Because they just don't have it. But Commander X is really, really, really good at running and finding value out of those numbers. And then you combine that with his excellent strategic coaching knowledge, and we have like a really unique niche in that we're able to just run and read numbers probably better than any team in the league. And so Commander X is kind of an odd one, right? He's not like traditional strategic coach or traditional analyst, and he's kind of a hybrid of both. And then I think I kind of fall into a similar category where I have a lot of confidence in my strategic knowledge. Anybody who's familiar with any of my content, I feel like I have a good grasp of the game, period, just on a big macro picture whole. But I also have, literally 4,000 or 5,000 hours in individual review experience over the past 3 or 4 years. Like I've done so many reviews of every hero. So I did almost all of, about 90% of our one-on-ones. And what I would also often do is like have those one-on-ones tying into what our strategic vision was for the composition that we're playing, so that we're making sure that everybody's on the same page. So I wasn't just a strategic coach, I wasn't just a micro coach, I was actually a one-on-one coach tying in what the strategy that Commander XO, that Chris was coaching into our individual sessions. So it really just depends on the coach, depends on the proficiency. I think there's also times where I think this is like the irony here is like I'm a firm believer of like, if the player has like full investment and involvement and their own play, and they feel like they're really progressing and evolving on their own, don't touch it. I think like a good analogy is that we're not really I'm trying to think of like, what we are as gardeners, as coaches. That should be the goal. That we are building and nurturing plants. And if the plant is growing healthily, you need to give it space. You need to let it grow. You need to let them take responsibility. So, ironically, 2 of our star players are the Rhine meta, especially the first stage, and Backbone and Hadi, right? Backbone's mid. Whoa, Hadi's Rhine. I coached those guys the least out of all of the players one-on-one. And it was because they were so individually invested in their own goals and the own things they're working on. They're doing their self-review. They're like, all right, I'm gonna try this, or I'm gonna try that, or I've been working on this. They don't need me. They don't need me. I mean, if they're stuck or if there's something that I feel like they're underperforming at, then I would take time and go, okay, I think, for example, there's a period of time where I think Backbone was getting really, really low value on Blizzard. And so I looked into it, right? And it was, honestly, the answer was really simple. It was just he needed to do a little bit more preparation between fights and thinking ahead of time and communicating a little bit better, right? But for the most part, for those two guys, just let them be. They were hard workers. They were smart guys. They were constantly doing their own thing. And the same thing with Landon. Sometimes with Landon, he'd be a meta he's really struggling with, and I'd work with him a lot, give him a lot of, mostly, honestly, a lot of support for what he's doing, right? You're doing fine, just hang in there, you're doing... and then once he gets to a point where he's comfortable and he feels like he's progressing, then leave him be. Let him handle and take responsibility for his own play at that point. And like you said, every player is different, and it's about kind of getting, not just like telling the player what to do, but also like you really got to get to know the players. The most effective reviews I have are with the people that I know the best. And that's the dichotomy of a coach, right? Is you don't necessarily aren't always their friend, but you got to know them. You got to know them as people. You got to care for them. Otherwise, you're just not going to be an effective coach.
And they're not going to take what you have to say,
exactly.
like, legitimate. Like, how did you deal, like, did you ever deal with this, or how do you overcome this issue of, like, the idea that pro players, they're better than we are, right? Like, they understand the game at a way higher level. How do you give effective coaching? Like, is it more about you making them question themselves, or is it about you just throwing out ideas that provoke thought? Like, how do you like to do that level of coaching? So,
I mean, it helps a lot when you have a little bit of a reputation going in. I remember when I first started coaching, that was a huge problem, right? People didn't know who I was. Like, who are you? Just some random dude, But as time goes on, like, Spilo, he knows what he's talking about. That's fine. But even then, I try to not assume that I have the buy-in. I try and build that camaraderie, try and build that trust. I actually remember the very first review I ever did with Admiral Raptor, back when he was still Admiral Raptor. Before we just picked him up. I don't even know if he was announced yet. We're just trying to build a little bit of like relationships. He was playing Overwatch 1 ranked. And it was on Eichenwald, and the entire review on his Batiste was me asking questions. I literally went into the review, I was like, hey, I just want to look at this review, and I want to just kind of, all I'm going to do is ask questions. And it's not passive-aggressive, not trying to imply anything. I'm just going to ask questions. So we'd start the review, we'd go look at the team fight, and then I'd just say, hey, you're playing Batiste. Was there a better position than where you held? Did you use your shift the best that you possibly could? And then he would say, well, yeah, I think it did. And then we'd end up discussing the shift. We discussed the positioning. And then we did that over and over and over. And it was a little bit tedious, like 40 minutes in. And then I just said, all right, that's it. We're done. And then I said, okay, you tell me, after we've been through all of these team fights, what do you need to improve on? Because we've been over like the details of every fight. Could you position better here? Could you shift better here? What's the takeaway here? And I remember the takeaway at the time was he needed to be a little bit more proactive with shooting out DPS, shooting out tanks and angles, like a little bit more like positioning himself in a way to where he was kind of more preventively protecting himself rather than reactively just standing in one spot. But I didn't tell him that, right? I would ask pointed questions because I would see things that would, but I wanted him to come to that conclusion on his own, and then come to that conclusion. Because if he comes up with that idea, if he comes up with that goal, then that's going to stick so much better than anything that I could ever possibly say. And especially because, I didn't have that buy-in. I didn't really know him that well. I didn't have that experience coaching him. That was how I needed to coach him for that situation. And I think, like, as time goes on, I built more camaraderie with Admiral. And he's a pretty smart guy, so usually didn't, but as the course of the season went along, there was a couple times where I said, Admiral, this sucks. I really think you should try this. And he'd be like, okay, but like you gotta
build to that, right?
You gotta build to that. You gotta build to that. And even when you get to that point, for a lot of players, that's not where you want to be. Sometimes players just like being roasted a little bit and they're cool with it. But sometimes, like a player like Admiral, he's a really smart guy and he puts a lot of thought into his play. So even then, that was a rarity with Admiral. Even when I did build that trust, usually it was more like I've been thinking about this. What do you think, right? And if nothing else, we come to a conclusion. So I think that's the key thing. Where like other players, Sparker, I could just tell him, you're being an idiot. What are you doing here? And he'd laugh about it. He'd think it's funny, and then we'd figure it out. It just depends.
The biggest thing that I would say if you're an aspiring coach or that kind of stuff, and you've sort of laid this out perfectly, is just about helping the players come to their own conclusions in a lot of ways, because that's what's going to stick with them. One of the big ones that I think really stands out on my mind that I think got overhyped in the past was like the JMac essay that he wrote for the Paris Eternal players, and I said this when it first came out, I'm like, it's not always a great way of coaching. You can tell someone, you can give them a laundry list of things that they're doing wrong, unless they really understand that the reasoning of the why and how to, and coming to a conclusion and recognizing themselves. It's so hard to work 100%. With that and fix those mistakes.
Well, you talked about it earlier. You talked about in that one forget the coach's name, Damien, where it's like it's just too much to process. There's just no possible way you can process that. Like the human brain learns through processes called like chunking, right, where people see patterns, right, and they're able to kind of memorize this plus that, but that takes time. That takes a lot of time. And no commentary on JMEC or his current coaching. I know those guys are dealing with a lot of adversity, but that the essay isn't coaching. That is information. A lot of times the players might already have the information that they need. It's about what they personally need to execute, or even the way they're thinking about it. Like you said, the AMP thing, maybe it wasn't a lack of understanding on your part, it was just a lack of focus at key moments. This is what makes players like Kevster and Proper so great, is not just that they have these crazy high mechanical peaks, because I think their peaks are high, but I think that you look at so many Genjis in the league, when they're playing in flow state, the gap is very, very, very small.
Yeah, absolutely, right.
But what makes them great is that they're just so consistently good, Maybe they're not, Proper's not like literally like hitting every shuriken, but he's like, how many bad games has Proper had this season? How many bad games has Kevster? Even this stage, how many bad games has Kevster had this season?
He was like a top 4 Genji, like statistically, even though his team went like tragically bad.
And I think you were talking about Kai on stream earlier. I was chiming in when I was turning my stream on, and it's the same thing. It's like that to me is the real caliber of a true player, and I think like that's what Backbone's path has been like, can I not just play Genji at a peak level in scrims? Oh, I'm diffing Proper, oh man. But can I do that in an official? And then can I do that again? And then can I do that again? And then can I do that again?
Do you think that's like one of the most underrated aspects of a player is just confidence? I know a lot 100%. Of average players who just outperform themselves due to just unreasonable confidence in themselves, and that's the thing, as you said about Proper. Like, you just watch Proper play the game, and like the way he moves around, like he plays as if he's never gonna miss, and then he never does miss because he just plays in that 100%. State. Like, I think everyone who's ever played Overwatch can say, like, that when tensions get high, you hit that overtime, all of a sudden the adrenaline starts flowing. It's so easy to get in your head. You miss a couple of shots, all of a sudden you start losing that confidence. Like, is that something that you've seen, like, that London Spitfire has had any issues with this season, of just like you had one or multiple players lose confidence in themselves?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that every team struggles with in any sport. I mean, I think everybody, even if you don't compete in Overwatch, if you've played a game, or you've played a video game, or you played even just a sport, flow state is very real, and it allows you to play better mechanically. Like, when you start thinking too much, you start playing worse. And I know that sounds different, but when the game, especially of Overwatch, is just too fast and too complicated for you to be thinking. You just have to flow, you just have to feel. And so when you lose that confidence and you start thinking to compensate, you start slowing down. And like you said, it is really an underrated skill. It is really an underrated skill. I think you look at a lot of these, I think the NA Hive Mind, the joke about like the Atlanta Rain in seasons past, like that team performed really well when it was confident. Even though, because for whatever reason, I don't know if it's just NA ego, those guys just occasionally hit these flow states where they just believe that they were the best, and all of a sudden they start overperforming, and like they're in grand finals against Shanghai Dragons. Like, obviously there's a lot of factors that goes into that, right? But like, I think that was a crucial one. And again, like, look at a team like the Glads. Like, Glads just, they get on LAN and they're just like, the ego comes out and they just don't care. And you're gonna play well. You're gonna play well with that. Now, there are downsides. Too much ego can cause a lot of other issues, internal and external. But I think there is lack of confidence is 100% something that hurts and hinders players.
Yeah, and it's actually, I reference this a lot of times, but it's funny because in 2018, I remember when I was on the Dallas field, Johnny wrote this article. Reinforced, like, it was about the Dallas field, and he was saying it was like this mentality of playing to win instead of playing to not lose. And I think a lot of teams and players get into this mentality a lot of the time, where it's like they're so worried about losing that they're not thinking about how they win 100%. The game, and they start playing in a way that, yes, maybe they're not feeding in the lobby, but they're all of a sudden leaving their teammates out to dry, and then all of a sudden teammates lose confidence in each other, and that's how you generally see these implosions of these teams. And that all goes back to that confidence aspect that we were saying. Right.
And it's hard to get back too. It is an ethereal thing to hold on to. I mean, I think when we beat the Reign ending stage 1, right, on that Colosseo Rhine matchup, that was the one thing Chris said. He's like, guys, do not play to not lose, play to win, right? Don't be scared to make mistakes. Let's finish this out with some balls. And I think that we did.